The year was 1943. The Pacific Ocean, once a vast stretch of blue paradise, had become a graveyard of ships and men. Islands that once held nothing but coconut trees and coral sands were now names written in blood. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Peleliu. The air was thick with humidity and death. Among the countless men arriving on the shores of the Pacific that year was a 29-year-old Navy doctor named Lieutenant James Whitaker. He was not a warrior, not trained to kill, but to save. And yet, as his landing craft neared the island, he realized he was stepping into a world where medicine met madness, where survival itself was an act of defiance. The beach ahead was alive with fire. Explosions churned sand into smoke. Palm trees splintered into black dust. Men dove for cover, their helmets ringing like church bells under the rain of bullets. When the ramp dropped, Whitaker's boots hit the surf. His uniform clung to his skin, and his hands clutched a battered medical bag, his only weapon in a war built on destruction. He ran through chaos. Shouts filled the air. "Medic! Medic!" from every direction. He stumbled to a Marine lying half buried in the sand, a crimson stain spreading across his chest. Whitaker tore open his shirt, pressed gauze against the wound, and yelled for help. No one came. For a moment, the world around him disappeared. No gunfire, no screams, just the thundering heartbeat of a man trying to save another with bare hands. He tied off the wound with his own belt, lifted the soldier by the shoulders, and dragged him toward the nearest stretch of cover. When he finally looked up, he saw the hospital tent in the distance, a white flag marked with a red cross fluttering against a sky filled with smoke. That was his destination. That was where his war would begin. Inside the tent, the smell hit first. The heavy, suffocating mix of blood, sweat, and iodine. Dozens of wounded men lay side by side on stretchers made from bamboo and torn canvas. Their eyes darted, searching for help, for hope. Whitaker's commanding officer, an older surgeon with hollow eyes, shouted above the chaos, "Supplies are running out! Morphine's gone! Scalpels are down to 3! Make do, Lieutenant! Make do." Those 2 words would define everything he did from that day forward. He washed his hands in salt water, rolled up his sleeves, and stepped into his first operation of the war, a gunshot wound to the abdomen. The patient was conscious, trembling. Whitaker gritted his teeth, held the scalpel steady, and began to cut. Every motion was deliberate, precise, calm. Around him, the ground shook with artillery fire. Dust fell from the ceiling as explosions grew closer, but he didn't stop. He was trying to save lives, not to fear death. Hours passed. The operation ended in silence. The man lived. When Whitaker stepped outside the tent, the sun had already set. He could barely stand, but he smiled faintly. One life saved in a sea of chaos. Days turned into weeks. The wounded kept coming. Shrapnel, burns, bullet holes, missing limbs. The medical unit worked without rest. They ate when they could, slept when they couldn't. The sound of waves outside the tent mixed with the moans of the dying. One night, an air raid hit the camp. The sky erupted in orange and black as bombs rained down on the island. The medical tents shook violently. Instruments flew from tables. Lanterns shattered and fire spread across the canvas roofs. Whitaker dove under a cot, shielding a patient with his own body as a blast tore through the side of the tent. When the noise faded, he looked around in disbelief. The hospital was gone. Everything destroyed. He stood amid smoke and ash, the world silent except for the distant crackle of flames. No instruments, no morphine, no antiseptic. Just his hands. He took a deep breath and turned to his corpsman. "We're not done. The wounded still need us." And right there, under a canopy of palm trees, Surrounded by fallen leaves and fallen men, he began again. They dragged the survivors from the rubble and laid them on the bare ground. Whitaker boiled rainwater in tin cans, used combat knives as scalpels, and stripped parachute silk into bandages. The first operation he performed that night was on a Marine whose leg had been torn apart by shrapnel. There was no anesthesia left, only rum. Whitaker poured it down the man's throat, waited for his eyes to glaze, then whispered, "Hold on, son. You're going home." He worked by lantern light, his hands steady, his mind somewhere between heaven and hell. By dawn, he had performed 7 surgeries. His hands were blistered, his clothes were soaked with blood. He sat by the shore, watching the sun rise over the wrecked beach. The ocean looked peaceful again, as if the war had never existed. He thought of home.
Hold still!
The clean hospitals, the smell of coffee,
Stop the bleeding.
the steady hum of peace. It all felt like a dream from another life. A corpsman approached and handed him a canteen. "Doc," the young man said, voice trembling. "How do you do it? How do you keep going?" Whitaker took a long sip of water, stared at the horizon, and replied quietly, "Because someone has to." That morning, new landing craft arrived, carrying fresh troops, and more wounded. The war had no mercy, no pause, and neither could he. He looked at his blood-stained hands, flexed them, and walked back toward the smoking jungle where the next battle waited. For Lieutenant James Whitaker, the fight was never about victory. It was about keeping men alive when the world itself was dying. And deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. Days turned to weeks, and weeks into months. The jungle of Peleliu had swallowed everything. The tents, the roads, even the men. When the bombing stopped, what remained was not a base, not a camp, but a scattered collection of wounded soldiers and exhausted medics clinging to survival in the sweltering Pacific heat. Lieutenant James Whitaker had no roof over his head, no instruments, and no anesthetic. But he had one thing that refused to die: his will. He began building what he called the hospital without walls. He and his corpsmen cleared a small area in the forest, cutting vines, leveling the ground, and stretching tattered canvas between trees for shade. The operating table was a plank of wood laid over empty ammunition crates. Sterilization came from boiling rainwater. Lighting came from kerosene lanterns. The jungle itself became his ward. Each morning, he woke to the sound of waves crashing against coral and the cries of the wounded echoing through the trees. He moved from patient to patient, checking wounds, changing bandages, whispering encouragements. The men called him Doc Whit. When food ran out, he shared his own rations, just a handful of rice and dried meat. When morphine ran out, he tore strips of cloth, stuffed them in men's mouths, and told them to bite down. He learned to improvise. He used coconut water as plasma substitute, a technique discovered by Allied medics in the Pacific when IV fluids were scarce. He carved splints from bamboo, fashioned clamps from wire, and used empty bullet casings as suction tubes. What once seemed impossible now became routine. One night, a soldier was brought in with a stomach wound. The shrapnel had torn through his intestines, and the bleeding wouldn't stop. Whitaker knelt beside him. The man's skin was cold, his breathing shallow. "Can you fix me, Doc?" the Marine whispered, barely conscious. Whitaker looked at the wound. He didn't have forceps, sutures, or sterilized gauze, just his hands. He hesitated for half a second. Then he answered quietly, "I can try." He tore a strip from his own uniform, boiled it for a minute, and began to work. He reached into the wound, removed the fragments one by one, then stitched the torn flesh using fishing line and a sewing needle. For 4 hours, he worked by lantern light, sweating, shaking, his lips moving in silent prayer. When he finished, he sat back, his hands trembling. The soldier was still alive, still breathing. Whitaker smiled faintly and whispered, "That's enough for tonight." By dawn, his small patch of jungle looked like a scene from another world. Dozens of men lay under the trees, covered in blankets or leaves, the air heavy with the scent of medicine, smoke, and salt. The corpsmen joked that the palm trees had become IV poles. Whitaker laughed softly, the first real laugh he'd had in weeks. But beneath the humor was exhaustion deeper than words. He hadn't slept or more than 2 hours at a time. His hands were blistered, his eyes bloodshot. The war never paused. Every sunrise brought new casualties. He began keeping notes in a small waterproof notebook. The pages were filled with sketches of improvised tools, wound diagrams, and records of surgeries performed under impossible conditions. He called it his field manual for the forgotten. By mid-1944, the war had moved to new islands, but Peleliu remained scarred, a forgotten battlefield still echoing with gunfire. One day, a messenger arrived, a young corporal covered in mud, carrying a letter sealed in wax. It was an order from command. Evacuation impossible. Hold position. Provide medical support until further notice. Whitaker stared at the paper for a long time. Then he folded it neatly, placed it in his breast pocket, and said quietly, "Understood." He knew what it meant. No help was coming. Weeks later, a tropical storm hit the island. Rain fell like bullets, turning the ground into rivers of mud. The tents collapsed, fires went out, and supplies washed away. Whitaker and his men huddled under a tarp, clutching what little equipment they had. When the storm passed, the hospital was gone again, just like before. But by sunrise, they were rebuilding. The wounded couldn't wait. Whitaker's corpsmen looked to him for strength, and he gave it, even when his own body began to fail. He'd developed an infection in his left arm, the result of a cut gone untreated. It swelled and burned, but he ignored it, wrapping it tightly in cloth and continuing his work. He refused to stop. One evening, as he cleaned a wound by candlelight, a Marine lying nearby asked him, "Doc, don't you ever get scared?" Whitaker paused, stared at the flickering flame, and replied, "Every minute of every day, but fear keeps my hands steady." The Marine smiled weakly and said, "Then you'll live forever." Whitaker chuckled, but in his heart, he knew no one lived forever in war. Still, if he could give another man a few more minutes, a few more heartbeats, then it was worth everything. That night, he sat alone outside the camp. The jungle hummed with insects and faraway thunder. He looked up at the stars, faint, barely visible through the clouds. For a brief moment, he imagined himself back home. The hospital corridors, the white lights, the polished instruments. He whispered softly into the darkness, "I'll see you again, when this is over." But deep down, he wasn't sure if he believed it anymore. The war was changing him, shaping him into something unrecognizable. A man who operated without tools, without rest, without hope, yet still, somehow, refused to stop. The jungle was quiet before the storm. Too quiet. The wind carried the scent of salt and smoke, and somewhere far beyond the trees, artillery thundered like distant drums. Lieutenant James Whitaker stood in the middle of his open-air hospital staring out at the horizon. His shirt was soaked with sweat, his boots heavy with mud. It was mid-October 1944. For 3 days, the men had whispered that the Japanese were preparing a counterattack. For 3 days, Whitaker prayed they were wrong. Then, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the first shell hit. The explosion tore through the tree line. A flash of red and white that lit the entire jungle. Palm leaves flew through the air like burning shrapnel. The ground shook beneath his feet. "Incoming!" a corpsman yelled. Before Whitaker could react, the second shell landed near the perimeter. Screams followed. The night had begun. By the time the shelling stopped, the camp was chaos. Smoke drifted through the trees. The cries of the wounded filled the air. Whitaker grabbed what remained of his supplies: a half-empty bottle of antiseptic, a few scalpels, a flashlight, and ran toward the cries. He found 3 men near the blast zone, torn apart by fragments of metal and earth. One was already gone. The other 2 were barely breathing. "Get me gauze! Anything!" he shouted. A corpsman ran forward, but his hands were empty. Everything had been destroyed again. The boxes, the bandages, the morphine. Whitaker didn't hesitate. He tore the bottom half of his own shirt, pressed it into the wound, and tied it down with a strip of rope. "Doc, he's not gonna make it," the corpsman whispered. Whitaker looked the man dead in the eyes and said, "Then he's not dying without a fight." As the night deepened, more men arrived, carried on stretchers, dragged through the mud, their faces pale under the flickering light of lanterns. Whitaker moved from one to the next like a machine. He didn't feel the pain in his own arm anymore. The infection had spread, but he ignored it. He stitched a chest wound with fishing line. He splinted a broken leg with bamboo. He drained fluid from a collapsed lung using a hollow reed. The air was thick with the metallic smell of blood. Rain began to fall, first in drops, then in sheets. It soaked everything: the wounded, the tools, the earth beneath them. The jungle became a river of mud and pain. Hours passed. He worked without stopping. The lanterns sputtered, threatening to go out. At one point, he looked down and realized his hands were trembling uncontrollably. He hadn't eaten in almost 2 days. His head spun. A young Marine, barely 19, lay before him with a shrapnel wound to the abdomen. "Doc," the boy whispered, "am I gonna die?" Whitaker pressed his hand to the soldier's shoulder, his voice soft but firm. "Not tonight." He reached for his last clean instrument, a scalpel he'd sharpened himself on a rock, and began to operate. He cut open the wound, steadying his hands as the lantern flickered. He could barely see through the rain and sweat dripping down his face. Every move felt slower, every breath heavier. Around him, the jungle groaned under the weight of battle. Flares lit the sky, casting shadows across the camp. Each flash of light revealed faces, pale, terrified, bleeding. Whitaker lost track of time. He moved from one body to another, working until his fingers cramped, his vision blurred, and his knees buckled. At one point, he dropped the scalpel. It fell into the mud. He stared at it for a long second, then picked it up, wiped it on his sleeve, and kept going. He had nothing left to give, yet somehow he kept giving. By midnight, his hands were swollen, his back locked with pain. He'd performed more than 20 surgeries, with no anesthesia, no light, no rest. The corpsman begged him to stop. "Doc, you're gonna drop dead." He looked at them, his face ghostly in the lamplight, and whispered, "Not yet. Not while they're still breathing." He forced himself through one more operation, an amputation on a man whose leg had been crushed by debris. He tied a rope above the wound, took a deep breath, and began to cut. The soldier screamed, but Whitaker didn't flinch. His jaw clenched, his eyes steady. When it was done, he cauterized the wound with a red-hot knife heated over a lantern. The smell of burning flesh filled the air. The rain washed the blood away into the mud. At dawn, the firing stopped. A faint, eerie silence settled over the island. Whitaker stepped outside the tarp-covered shelter and looked around. Bodies lay everywhere, some still, some breathing shallowly. Birds returned to the trees, their calls echoing faintly through the mist. He sank to his knees, his body shaking, and stared at his hands, covered in cuts, blood, and dirt. He couldn't tell which blood was his anymore. A corpsman walked up beside him, voice trembling. "Doc, you saved over 50 men tonight." Whitaker didn't answer. He just looked toward the rising sun, its light cutting through the smoke and fog. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "No, I just kept them from dying." For the first time in months, he allowed himself to rest. He lay on the damp ground, eyes half closed, listening to the waves. The war wasn't over. It never really was. But as he drifted into exhausted sleep, one thought stayed with him. The faint heartbeat of every soldier he had pulled back from death, echoing in the silence. He had become more than a doctor. He was the line between life and nothingness, a man who refused to surrender to despair. By early 1945, the Pacific War was changing. News drifted through broken radios and half-burned letters. The Allies were winning, island after island falling to the American advance. But for those trapped on Peleliu, victory meant little. The men were still dying the same way they always had, slow, painful, and far from home. Lieutenant James Whitaker had stopped keeping count. The notebook that once recorded every surgery now lay water-stained and unreadable. His hands, once precise and quick, trembled from exhaustion. Infection had spread up his arm. The veins were dark, the skin hot. He kept it wrapped, changed the dressing when he could, and told no one. Each morning, he would check the wounded, what remained of them, and whisper the same line. "We made it through another night." The younger corpsman believed him. Whitaker no longer did. One evening, a Marine stumbled into camp supported by 2 comrades. A mortar shell had exploded nearby, leaving him with a gaping wound in his side. Whitaker looked down, his stomach sinking. The man's pulse fluttered weakly. He had no morphine, no clamps, no fresh bandages. The supply ship promised weeks ago had never arrived. The rain began again, soft at first, then heavy, a curtain between them and the world. Whitaker crouched beside the soldier and said quietly, "Hold on, son. I'm here." He reached for his kit. A tin box rusted at the corners. Inside, there was little more than wire, fishing line, and a piece of broken mirror he used as a reflector. He set to work. The blood flowed fast, soaking through the rag beneath his hands. He tried to close the wound, but his own fingers were shaking too much. The wire slipped, cutting into his glove. "Doc, you're bleeding," a corpsman said. Whitaker ignored him. He pressed harder, his voice a low growl. "Not him, not tonight." But within minutes, the Marine was gone. Whitaker sat back, motionless, rain dripping from his chin. For the first time in years, he felt utterly defeated. He whispered to himself, "I've lost the war in my own hands." That night, he walked alone through the shattered forest. The lightning illuminated twisted trees, helmets half buried in the mud, rifles rusting beside nameless graves. He reached the beach, where waves crashed against coral, and stared at the horizon. Somewhere beyond that darkness lay home, hospitals, light, and the sound of laughter. But he was thousands of miles away, and every man sleeping behind him depended on him surviving one more day. He knelt and plunged his infected arm into the seawater. The salt burned like fire, but he didn't move. He let it sting until the numbness took over. In the distance, he saw the faint glow of burning oil from wrecked ships, the ghosts of battles already lost. He whispered to the night, "If there's still a God watching, then let me finish what I started." By dawn, he returned to camp, limping, his arm bound tighter. The men saw him and straightened instinctively, as if his presence alone kept them standing. A corpsman approached with a tin mug of weak coffee. "Doc, you look worse than the rest of us." Whitaker smiled faintly. "Then I'm doing my job right." He gathered his team and began his rounds again. The men needed him, and that was enough. Weeks passed. Supplies dwindled to almost nothing. They tore pages from manuals to use as bandages, melted spent bullets for makeshift sutures. One corpsman carved a new handle for Whitaker's scalpel out of driftwood. The hospital had become a symbol, an act of defiance. Even when they could not save, they refused to abandon. Then came word from a patrol. A Japanese medical officer had been captured nearby. Among his belongings was a small kit containing alcohol, clean gauze, and surgical needles. Whitaker stared at it in disbelief. It wasn't much, but to him it looked like salvation. He cleaned every instrument by hand, humming softly, almost reverently. Then he turned to his men and said, "Gentlemen, tonight we operate with tools again." That night, a soldier came in with a shattered jaw, a bullet wound that had torn through his face. Whitaker used the captured kit for the first time. The light from a single lantern glowed on his face as he worked. The corpsman stood in silence, passing him instruments as if in a chapel. He sutured the flesh with trembling care, whispering every step under his breath, a ritual of focus and faith. Hours later, when it was done, he stepped back and exhaled. The man was breathing. The wound was closed. The corpsman clapped softly, eyes shining. Whitaker wiped his hands on his sleeve, his voice hoarse but steady. "The tools help, but it's the hands that matter." That night, he sat beside the fire, staring at his notebook, pages warped and blood-stained, filled with sketches and lists. He began to write again. He wrote about the men, their courage, their laughter in pain. He wrote about the nights when medicine was hope, and hope was all that kept them alive. He ended the entry with one line. "If I don't make it home, tell them we built a hospital from ashes." The ink bled on the page, but the words remained. It was August 1945. The jungle was silent for the first time in years. No artillery, no gunfire, just the whisper of wind through broken palms. Lieutenant James Whitaker sat on a fallen tree staring at the waves. The ocean glittered like glass, but he could barely recognize the sound of peace. For months, rumors had drifted through the camps. The Japanese were surrendering. The war was ending. But out here, on this forgotten island, no one knew for sure. Radios failed, messengers never returned, and time had stopped meaning anything. Still, something had changed. The sky no longer burned at night, and for the first time in years, the smell of smoke had begun to fade. Whitaker was down to his last few patients, men who had survived everything the war could throw at them. He walked among them like a father among sons. Some saluted weakly when he passed, others just smiled. They had all come to believe in him, the doctor who built life from nothing, who saved them with his bare hands. That morning, a corpsman rushed to him, out of breath. "Doc, we found someone, down by the beach." Whitaker grabbed his kit and followed. There, lying half buried in the sand, was a Japanese soldier, young, barely 20, his uniform torn, his leg wrapped in a blood-soaked cloth. The boy's eyes fluttered open in fear as Whitaker knelt beside him. "Easy," Whitaker said softly. "I'm not your enemy." The corpsman hesitated. "Doc, he's one of them." Whitaker didn't look up. "He's a patient." He cleaned the wound, washed it with seawater, and bandaged it with the last strip of linen he had. The soldier stared at him in silence, then whispered in broken English, "Why? Help me?" Whitaker paused, then answered quietly, "Because that's what doctors do." That night, he sat by the fire beside the wounded Japanese boy. Neither spoke for hours. The flames danced, lighting their tired faces. Two men from different worlds, united by suffering. When dawn broke, the boy smiled weakly and whispered, "War. Finished." Whitaker looked toward the horizon, his heart pounding. Was it true? Could it finally be over? Moments later, a radio crackled to life in the distance. Through static and fading signal came a voice. English, strained but clear. "This is headquarters. Japan has surrendered. The war is over. I repeat, the war is over." The words hung in the air like something unreal. The corpsmen froze. Then one by one, they began to cheer. Some laughed, others cried. Men who hadn't smiled in years fell to their knees, hands shaking, eyes wet. Whitaker didn't move. He just stared at the jungle, his hospital without walls, the graves marked with helmets, the memories of every life that had passed through his hands. He whispered, "It's finally over." Days later, rescue ships appeared off the coast. American flags rippled in the morning wind. The men lined up on the beach, saluting as the first boats arrived. Whitaker stood at the edge of the water, barefoot, his clothes worn to rags. He looked nothing like the officer who had landed 2 years earlier. His body was thin, his face hollow, his hair streaked with gray, but in his eyes, calm, steady, unbroken, was the same fire that had carried him through every night of blood and rain. When he stepped aboard the ship, sailors saluted. Some whispered his name. One young ensign said, "Sir, they told us what you did. You're a hero." Whitaker shook his head. "No, son. Heroes die in war. I just survived it." In the weeks that followed, the world celebrated victory. Parades filled the streets back home. Bands played. Flags waved. But Whitaker couldn't join the noise. When he finally returned to the mainland, he went straight to the naval hospital. The smell of antiseptic and clean sheets felt foreign. He couldn't get used to the silence. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw faces. The men who didn't make it, the ones whose names he'd written in blood on the pages of his notebook. He kept the notebook always close. The field manual for the forgotten. The ink had faded, the pages torn, but the stories were alive. He began teaching younger doctors, showing them how to improvise, how to work with nothing. He told them that medicine wasn't about instruments or technology. It was about courage, the kind that keeps your hand steady when your heart is breaking. Years passed. Whitaker grew older, quieter. He never spoke of Peleliu unless asked, and even then, his words came slowly, softly. When journalists tried to glorify his story, he corrected them gently. It wasn't heroism. It was necessity. He spent his final years near the sea, the same sea that had once carried him to war. Every morning, he walked the shoreline with a cane, listening to the waves, remembering the rhythm of life and death he had once known so well. When he died in 1967, at the age of 53, his ashes were scattered over the Pacific, the same waters that had once been his bat, Sleefield, his hospital, and his home. Among his few belongings was the notebook. On the last page, in faded ink, were his final words. "For every life I could not save, I saved another. For every night I thought I'd lost my faith, I found it again in the faces of men who refused to die. I was just a doctor, but on that island, that was enough." As the camera fades to sepia, the narrator's voice softens. In a war defined by destruction, one man fought not to take life, but to preserve it. He had no tools, no comfort, no hope, only hands, courage, and an oath he never broke. Lieutenant James Whitaker, the doctor who operated on the battlefield with no tools. The image blurs into a grainy black and white photo of the real WWII medics of the Pacific, men smiling faintly despite the chaos behind them. The music swells softly, a single violin over ocean waves. Fade to black.